Hello. So now we're on to chapter 5 of Maurizio. And chapter 5 actually lists four deities, Aphrodite, Ares, Hephaestus, and Eros. So Aphrodite, the goddess of love, desire; Ares, the god of war; Hephaestus, the god of blacksmithing, the god of fire; Eros, whose name just means desire, and the Roman name Cupid means the same thing. So, obviously, they're not going to focus on all of those. They're going to focus primarily on Aphrodite. The other gods are going to get sort of short shrift. There is one thing that's mentioned by Maurizio that is worth looking at, and I think I have it in the modules. If not, I'll probably put it there. But that is the story of the love triangle of Aphrodite, Ares, and Hephaestus, which is a story told within the Odyssey in Odyssey Book 8. And the premise is as follows. Aphrodite is married to Hephaestus. This is basically sort of a deal that's made. Hephaestus does a bunch of things for the gods. So Zeus arranges for Aphrodite to marry Hephaestus. Obviously, this is not going to really work. First of all, she's the goddess of sexual desire, so she's obviously not going to be tamed by a marriage. But even if she were, this is a sort of recipe for disaster. And it is sort of the setup for most love triangle stories. The woman is married to a successful person, but who is not a person of that the same age as the woman, and they don't have the same interests, and they're not really sexually, simpatico. And so she looks elsewhere for a playmate. And it's a funny story. In the Odyssey, that story serves as a contrast to Odysseus' situation. First of all, Odysseus has a wife who might very well remarry. If she does, it's disaster for him. He'll come home and he'll get killed, or something will happen to him. And that did happen to some of the Greeks returning from Troy. Idomeneus, the king of Crete, for instance, came back and his wife had remarried, and he basically had to go into exile. Agamemnon came back and got killed. So there were serious consequences if that happened. Now, Odysseus has a wife who is loyal to him, unlike Aphrodite. But for the gods, it's a big joke. For humans, there are serious consequences to that sort of thing. The main thing in chapter 5 is Homeric hymn number 5 to Aphrodite, which tells the story of Aphrodite and the Trojan prince Anchises. Now, the setup is as follows. Aphrodite is a powerful goddess. She is so powerful that she can actually tame all of the gods, with the exception of 3 goddesses. Those 3 goddesses are Artemis, the virgin goddess of the hunt; Athena, who's also a virgin goddess of wisdom and strategy and that sort of thing; and Hestia, the goddess of the hearth, who is of all the Greek Olympian, well, she's not an Olympian god, but of all the Greek gods, is the one that's the least anthropomorphized, right? She's not, she's basically thought of as the hearth, as the fireplace, which is also the center of the home life. So, I mean, she does have some importance in the rituals of a family, but she doesn't really have a whole lot of stories about her. But this gets to the point where, and what she does is, so she makes these gods not only fall in love with each other, but also fall in love with mortals. And there's something shameful about that, right? The gods have power and all this other stuff, and they're basically going after these creatures that are definitely beneath them. And so there's something shameful about that. Zeus is the one who in fact strays the most and who sleeps with the most mortals, right? He's the one who produces the most heroes. So it's getting to the point where Zeus's reputation is like people are like laughing behind his back. And Aphrodite is certainly laughing behind all the gods' backs because she has not yet fallen in love with a mortal, and therefore she can basically point the finger at them saying, look, they have no self-control. They're hopping in bed with mortals. Look at me. I'm much better than them. Well, Zeus says, yeah, enough. And so he makes her fall in love. It's not explained how, but he makes her fall in love with Anchises, a Trojan prince. And this tells the story of their sort of night together. again, it's just done sort of tongue-in-cheek. It's done as a humorous story. Anchises is, I think, comes across as a pretty funny character. So I think you'll sort of enjoy that that story. The scholarship in chapter 5 is sort of an article. I don't know. I'm not even sure if it was ever published as such. Because he refers to a talk that he went to, and there's some things there that make this look like it might have been originally an article in draft. So I don't know if it actually did get published in a journal or not. But by John Winkler, called "Laughter of the Oppressed." And here, in contrast to Foley, who said that myth supports the status quo or endorses the status quo, Winkler is going to argue the opposite, that myth can challenge the status quo. And of course, this is true. You can even see that in Homeric hymn number 2 to Demeter. There is some challenge of patriarchy, right? Demeter and Persephone are not happy about the situation. They accept the situation. They may take it as, this is the way things are and we have to accept it, but they don't like it. So there is clearly some sort of challenge there. It's not a total acceptance. But even in cases where you have a more direct challenge to the status quo, I wonder, is it really a challenge? I mean, it does not overturn the status quo. So it's almost as if we're going to allow people to protest, but we're not going to change the way we do things. By allowing them to protest, they blow off steam and therefore maybe don't have a revolution. So that's good. But ultimately that helps the status quo, right? If you try to crush protests, then the protests get more violent and they get stronger, and then you actually do have overthrowing of the government. So part of me thinks that myth theoretically can challenge the status quo, but it really doesn't. There are a lot of, for instance, slave stories that feature Brer Rabbit, American slave stories. Rabbit was a trickster figure in Africa. And why would he be a trickster figure? Well, rabbits sort of are perceived as being tricky. They're also not rabbits are not going to stand up against wolves and other sort of animals who are much tougher than they are. And so they have to sort of live by their wits. They can't rely on their strength. And that, of course, stood for the slaves. That stood for them against their masters. Right? The slaves did not have the physical power to actually revolt and overthrow their masters and get their freedom. What they could do is, within the system, they could do things to sabotage the master, or they could make fun of the master behind the master's back, or they could do other things. And so there was a challenge to the status quo. Slaves were not like, oh yeah, well, we're slaves, so that's okay. They were not. But those stories of Brer Rabbit and stuff allow them to see someone outwit the man. And so there's some comfort to that, but ultimately that tends to help the status quo, right? Because if you don't have that outlet, then again, it's going to erupt in an actual violent thing. So the myth that Winkler's talking about is the myth of Adonis. Adonis was a young man that Aphrodite fell in love with. He went out. He was a hunter. He went out hunting. He ended up getting gored by a boar. So he caught it right in the manliness, and then died. And there was a festival in Athens called the Adonia, the festival of Adonis. And part of the festival involved planting these seeds, which apparently sprung up almost immediately. They sprung up within a day. And they lasted for about a day or so, and then they would wilt. So the implication is, so the women are doing this ritual. The men are not in this ritual. But the implication is that, like men, right, they come to attention, but it doesn't last. Whereas women's sexual power presumably lasts, right, because it's not tied to that particular blood flow that sort of causes something to get erect and then suddenly limp. And that's part of the whole thing. And by the way, in the story of Aphrodite and Anchises in Homeric hymn number 5, what Anchises is afraid of, he's afraid that he's going to lose sexual power by sleeping with a goddess, right? So first he suspects she is a goddess, and he's correct, but he doesn't know that, and he promises to build her a shrine, do all these other things to basically put her off so they don't go to bed. She then lies to him. They do go to bed. And then the next morning, she says, "Hey, Anchises, do I look like I did last night?" And then he immediately realizes what happened, and he basically totally freaks out and says, you lied to me, and so forth and so on. Make me a god, because I don't want to basically live a life impotent. And then Aphrodite says, "Well, that's not going to happen to you." But the point is, that's usually what happens to male mortal lovers of goddesses, is they become impotent. They lose their sexual vitality, right? So the goddess loves them all up. Okay, I wanted to say one thing about syncretism. So especially on the island of Cyprus, but of course syncretism happens all the time everywhere. Syncretism is when two different cultures, two different belief systems, they come into contact with one another, and then what happens is you start borrowing from the other. Right, this happens with any cultural sort of situation. Right, America, one of our main musical forms is jazz, which comes originally out of African music, and then of course it changes over time. But that's only possible sort of originally in America, because America does have the black and white mix, and therefore it allows for a mix of two different sort of cultural strains. But on the island of Cyprus, which is just off the coast of modern-day Lebanon, ancient Phoenicia, that's Aphrodite's cult center, right? That's her sort of headquarters. And on that island, there's evidence of Aphrodite and Ishtar, who's a Mesopotamian goddess, Astarte, who's another goddess from the east, Inanna, who's another goddess from the east, and the Paphian, who is a Cypriot goddess. They're all sort of worship of them are all going on at the same time on the island of Cyprus, and apparently they would mix and match so that Aphrodite gets more and more like Ishtar and Inanna, and presumably on the other side they become more like Aphrodite. So there's this mix of the goddess on that island, and that's sort of important. But that island especially provided a lab for that. The Nachleben in the chapter deals with the Pygmalion story and how it is retold in 4 films. So the Pygmalion story goes as follows. Pygmalion is a sculptor living on the island of Cyprus. The women of Cyprus have insulted Aphrodite in some way. Aphrodite causes the women to become sex-crazed. So the women are basically having sex with anyone, anything, animals, whatever they can find, like all over the island of Cyprus, like in the middle of the street, in public. And Pygmalion, who's sort of prudish to begin with, sees this and it's basically like, gross. Girls have cooties, and doesn't want to have anything to do with women. And so he sublimates his sexual desire into his sculpting. He's a sculptor, and he makes this beautiful statue of a woman, and he falls in love with the statue. And Ovid tells the story, and Ovid likes to talk about weird stuff anyways, and Ovid really plays it up. But he basically takes the statue to bed, which it's a marble statue, which means it weighs a ton. So exactly how that happened, I don't know, but it's a sort of an interesting idea. And then when the festival of Aphrodite comes up the next time, he goes to the festival, and while he's there, he says a silent prayer to Aphrodite, saying that what he would like is he would like a woman just like this beautiful statue that he's made. And so he goes home, and the statue comes to life. Right. So that story got turned into a play by George Bernard Shaw called Pygmalion. And that tells the story of Professor Henry Higgins and how he changed the flower girl Eliza Doolittle into a lady. Right, so that's the story Pygmalion. That was then made into a musical, My Fair Lady, which tells the same story but with songs. The other two films that are mentioned are Pretty Woman and Lars and the Real Girl. But there are a bunch of other films that you could also look at. Weird Science is one where the two geeks basically create this hot woman as a science experiment. Pinocchio, in some ways, could be seen as that way. I mean, if we remove the sex aspect out of it, then you've got Geppetto wants a son. He creates this wooden boy who becomes basically a surrogate son until he becomes a real boy. So you get that same sort of thing. So one of the extra credit things you can do for the class is you can see one of the movies that are mentioned, or if you come up with another film that has the same basic plot idea, you can watch that, and then you can write sort of a report on that as an extra credit thing. So we're not going to spend a lot of time on really talking about that, but if you've seen any of those films, you can reflect on how that actually reconfigures the Pygmalion story. So that finishes up chapter 5. Next time we'll come back with chapter 6, which looks at Athena and Poseidon.